It's Mark Yegge here, wealth architect and lifestyle investor. Let's take your life to the next level. Welcome to the Wealth Architect Podcast.
Welcome back. Okay, now the questions start to get a little bit wonky. People say, well, what is blockchain? What is cryptocurrency? I'm going to explain in this video what blockchain is. It's actually pretty simple once you get your brain around it, but I don't want to make it complicated. So what I do is I use an analogy to explain it. So here we've got a journal, right? This blank journal, there's nothing written in it. And let's say that you and me and your mom and dad, for example, are sitting at a cocktail party, right? And we're sitting around a cocktail table and we're just sitting there talking. And we say, hey, let's write a book. And so I write the first line of the book. And I say, I take my pen out and I write, the dog bit Mark. And I close the book and I pass it over to you, right? And you open it and you go, hey, it looks like Mark wrote the dog bit Mark. I'm going to write my sentence. So I'm going to stamp it. Looks like I'm going to timestamp it. Looks like that's what Mark wrote. I'm going to write, and Mark screamed really loud. You're going to close the book and you pass it over to your mom, for example. Your mom's going to take the book, open it up and go, the dog bit Mark, and Mark screamed really loud. You timestamped yours. She timestamps hers because she's going to say, and there was lots of noise. She timestamps it, sends it along. And then your dad takes it, reads the first three sentences and says, that's correct. That's correct. The third sentence is correct. Let me add my sentence. And we just keep passing this book around and around the table. And we build this massive story. So at the end of it, the last transaction is the latest transaction. And the first page has my first initial thing in it. And so that's really a blockchain. Each of those sentences, let's call it a block. And what you do is you just kind of verify that the prior block is correct and you timestamp it. That's called the blockchain. There's a chain of sentences that we write. There's a chain of data that is written. And at the end of it, we have this massive book and it's got every transaction that happened before it in that book. Make sense? So at the end of it, you have this thing. Okay. Now let's translate it to cryptocurrency. This thing is a book. This thing is a blockchain. In the blockchain is every other transaction that happened prior to the exact present moment. So you can go back in the blockchain and you can find out the first actual use of currency in a, not just a mining situation where they created cryptocurrency, which is basically kind of how we did it. There's an additional step where you solve a math problem. That's called hashing. And you hash it in a cryptographic form. But we don't need to get into that. The bottom line is there's this book being built, right? So you can go back to that first transaction, that $10,000 set of pizzas. And that's in the blockchain for Bitcoin. You can go forward 5 years and you could find another transaction. It's in the blockchain for Bitcoin. Now, it's not just 4 people that have access to the blockchain. All 4 of them have to make sure that all 4 sentences are correct in that case, right? Once that person certifies that those other are correct, all the other nodes are doing the same thing at the same time. And so you have all these nodes that are proving that the prior transactions are all correct. If something isn't correct, it gets thrown out and the person who mined that is kind of kicked off the system. And so only the people that are verifying and not trying to game the system, not trying to cheat the system, are included in the system. Now, there's now millions of people sitting around the coffee table, millions, like tens of millions. And so no one person can change the coffee table. They all have to agree. And now that there's millions and millions of nodes, they're not going to agree to change it. They're not going to agree to add more, cryptocurrency or Bitcoin to the algorithm. They have to agree to make small changes if they want, but nobody's ever going to agree to do something not in their best interest. And so you can go to the last transaction and do a purchase. Like when I went to El Salvador, I bought dinner, which is dinner and a beer, right? For $2.75 approximately, but it was a certain number of Satoshis. That's a divisible number of cryptocurrencies, like pennies for us in dollars. And so I was able to just take my wallet from my phone, hold it up to the wallet from the seller's phone and buy their dinner from them with the beer. And it took, $2.75 at the time worth of Bitcoin out of my wallet, put it in theirs. Boom, it happened instantly. It was really a 10-second transaction. That transaction is somewhere on the blockchain. I can go find that transaction that I did a year ago in El Salvador, because El Salvador is now using Bitcoin, and I can find that transaction. And so let's talk about the benefits. There's your analogy. Let's talk about the benefits. Well, first of all, it's decentralized. There's no one person in charge of it. I can't change the blockchain. It's all there in the book. Number one. So that we don't have a central banker in charge of it. We don't have a president in charge of it. We don't have a group of oligarchs in charge of it. There's no one person in charge of it. In fact, there's no group of people that can be in charge of it. The second thing is it's distributed. Nobody has control of this ledger. It's a distributed ledger. So it's sent out around the world. Anybody that's running a Bitcoin node has a distributed copy of that ledger. So they can look at it and everybody else's is exactly the same. There's no changes. If there's a change, it's called a fork, right? It's a fork. And now there's two different copies of the ledgers and this one of them is going to change. And so that either changes and becomes thrown out or it becomes part of the existing blockchain. So it's a ledger. Every transaction is ledgerized in modern society. So when you go and make a deposit at your bank, that's put on the ledger as a liability for the bank and an asset for you, right? So there's two ledgerized transactions that are offsetting there. So there's always somebody that has a copy of those transactions. Any transaction you do, there's a debit and a credit, a liability, an asset. You can look at it like that. So it's a ledger. The blockchain and Bitcoin is no different. It's a ledger. It can't be altered. I can't change it. You can't change it. Nobody can change it. And if you change it, it becomes what's called a hard fork, right? That hard fork becomes its own currency then, right? So it happened in Bitcoin. They did a hard fork a few years ago and Bitcoin Cash was created. So they took all the transactions that were part of Bitcoin up until that point, and then they forked off of it. So now there's two different strings of it. There's one is Bitcoin and the other one is called Bitcoin Cash. Bitcoin Cash is no longer Bitcoin. It's got its own blockchain. It's doing its own thing and they're making their own rules and it's no longer affected by the other one. And the bottom line really is the difference is it's open and transparent. How many dollars are actually printed? How many dollars are in circulation? We don't really know. We believe that the Fed is telling us how many that there are. We believe we know how many ounces of gold there are in Fort Knox, but it's never been audited. We believe we know how much the central bank has in gold in Russia, but we really have no way of knowing. In the case of Bitcoin, it's a ledger that's public, it's open, and it's transparent. So you can go in there and find out any transaction that happened. You can see how quickly things are mined. You can see all of the data because all of the data is there. You can see the algorithm. And that's really the benefit. It's open and transparent and nobody can alter it. So that's the analogy I use. It's that storybook that we wrote. And that's what's been written for Bitcoin for the last 13 years, 14 years now. That story's been growing and growing and growing. Now there's billions of transactions, right? I mean, it trades millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin every day on the exchanges. And so every transaction is in there. Now it's billions. And that's why the algorithm is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you need more energy to run it. But all that energy to prove that it exists gives it validity, right? If you get free money from the government, you're not going to appreciate it as much as if you worked for it. So there's the proof of work in the free money. If you don't appreciate it, you're going to spend it maybe unwisely and you're going to blow it. If you have to work for it, you're going to be a little bit more careful with it. So the proof of work, which is another component of a decentralized blockchain that's properly constructed, means that there's work behind it and work behind it gives it its value, right? It's not just created out of thin air. Oh, and by the way, click at the bottom to start getting our next videos. Give us your email address and I'm going to start sending those videos directly to your inbox rather than having you come here. You can probably get them here too, but send us your email address or go ahead and just register underneath at the link here, and then we'll add videos to the series. And as they come out, then you'll be able to be the first to get them in the series. So anyway, see you on the next episode. Thanks. Bye.
You've been listening to the Wealth Architect Podcast with Mark Yegge. Follow us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Share and tell your friends. See you soon.